thank you all so much for hopping on today. We're really excited to talk to you all about, different approaches to closing the broadband gaps. And we've got some really great folks on here today with us who are going to be able to talk a little bit about that. Alex, if you could flip that slide. My name is Anderson Clayton. I'm the broadband analyst with the Center on Rural Innovation. And along with us today, we've got Jane Woodson, who's also a broadband analyst for the Center on Rural Innovation, and Alex Kelly, who is the head of broadband consulting for the Center on Rural Innovation, and Curtis Hansen, who is the project manager for the ARC region, who I actually think is out today. Alex, correct me if I'm wrong, but he's on vacation. He's on vacation, but I was about to say Curtis is part of the sponsors of this Broadband Bootcamp program. And so he's also someone that you can definitely reach out to with questions or concerns or just anything that you might want to know about the ARC region and what they're trying to do for broadband funding and expansion too, for program wise. But there are some really, general best practices to broadband planning in every context, but there are many different paths that can lead to good outcomes. And understanding broadband planning approaches, how they can vary from different location to location, and discussing a range of past examples are all the things that we're going to talk to you about today. We really want to go through, the basic planning framework, the typical planning process, example scenarios, and a few public-private partnership cases that you all can look at, take from, and use the examples from, we hope. But like we said earlier, and when I first started this off, not everything is going to be as comprehensive in this because the broadband landscape is ever changing. And one of the things that we're really here to do is help navigate you through that process. And so if you, like I said, if you don't learn what you need to today, there are 4 other sessions after this one that we would love to talk to you more about. And also hopefully we'll guide you through this process a little bit more, but we're also happy to have one-on-one conversations with folks and help. And with that, I'm going to pass it along to my coworker, Jane, who's going to take you through the basics.
Hello, everyone. So let's start out with one basic framework for thinking of broadband planning. At its foundation, broadband planning is basically 2 phases. First, of course, identifying the specific needs of your community, because every community is different. And then next, securing funding and partners who will be able to make your goals possible. So let's take a closer look at the broadband planning process. I'm going to break it down into 7 more specific steps and hopefully give you an idea of other frameworks that you could use during the broadband planning process. So here are the 7 steps. Align on community needs and project goals, understand the regulatory context, calculate approximate costs, create a funding plan, identify possible partners, and formalize and finalize that partnership, and finally fundraise and execute. So let's start with number 1, align on community needs and project goals. We can see some examples here based on our experience helping communities in the early stages of their broadband planning. So some needs that a community might face would include limited options for residential or business ISPs, service gaps, which can be scattered across an area or in pretty big chunks, contiguous, affordability challenges, poor customer service from the existing ISPs in the area, low adoption rates and usage, and gaps in cellular service. So those are just some examples of needs a community might encounter during the broadband planning process. Having that information is essential for our next step, which is identifying our specific broadband project goals. So again, here are some examples of goals that we've seen other communities pursue. Provide universal service of at least 100 megabits per second symmetrical, and also establish free public Wi-Fi in the town square, which can be very beneficial. Ensure affordable options for low-income residents. Entice more competition to improve customer service, increase internet adoption by 25% in the area, and fix gaps in cell service that have been noted by public safety. That can be a public safety issue. So now that we have identified the particular needs and the hurdles for this project, we need to understand the parameters in which we can begin to address these issues. We need to understand the regulatory context, and that will impact how you might choose to approach broadband planning. So some good questions to ask when you are focusing on understanding the regulatory context would include, what types of municipal interventions in broadband are allowed in your state? Are cooperative electrics allowed to build broadband in your area? What local broadband building procedures must be considered? For example, right-of-way, encroachment agreements, permits, etc. Which entities are allowed to pursue what funding sources? What rules does your state broadband office or state grant program have for building? For example, can you double fund RDOF locations, the locations that have already been awarded to a provider? Or can you build anywhere with 25 download, 3 upload speeds or lower? So these are just some good questions to ask. Of course, this varies from region to region, and it's really important to ask these questions pretty early on in the process, just so you understand what your next moves could be. Next, we can move on to calculating an approximate cost using the information you have. This probably won't be exact down to the dollar, but having an approximate cost for closing those broadband gaps in your community will help you choose a path to move forward with. It can be used to start conversations with potential partners and also help you decide what sort of network you're going to pursue. So some ways to work toward calculating an approximate cost to close the broadband gaps in your area include having conversations with neighboring ISPs so that they can give you an idea of typical local costs. We have an example here. An ISP might give you an average per mile cost for installing fibers. So 45K per mile for aerial fiber and 87 for underground. That's just kind of the format that they might use. Also, consultants can provide high-level network designs that can give you an idea of the estimated cost, and potential ISP partners can do the same. We do recommend that you have a third party verify that sort of information when you do receive a cost estimate from an ISP. I would definitely look into that. Cost estimates are especially important if you are being asked to contribute funding. Of course, you need to know how much money is needed in order to close those gaps. All right, so now we have all of the information about costs. We can use this information to create a funding plan. This entails identifying potential sources of funding, such as BEAD. So BEAD and DEA are 2 commonly discussed funding sources for broadband projects, but they are not the only ones. We also have Reconnect 5, the ARC programs, and state capital projects. Of course, all of these are different and have different rules, and particularly in the way that partnerships are structured, they might have different requirements. So it's important to look into that fairly early on as well. But that is not the only way to fund a network. You could also look into bonds and special options taxes in your areas. And that's something that we will have an entire session to discuss. We have a session on funding and financing networks, I believe on March 30th, which is a Thursday. So if you do want to learn more about that, definitely be there. We'll talk about this in detail. So next, we need to identify possible partners for this project, because it is very likely that you will need to work with another organization or other organizations in order to achieve your goals. So first, you should ask which entities are interested in working with you to serve the community. These can include ILECs, electric co-ops, ISPs, cable companies. And at that point, you would want to talk with the potential partner about your project goals so that you can understand if they are interested in working with you and what conditions they require in order to partner with you. They also would probably have funding requirements as well, so that's another important area to discuss. Some ambitious communities have decided to start an ISP sometimes municipally owned, in order to meet all of their needs because they couldn't find the appropriate partner. So that's something we can share with you later on if you do have any questions about that particular type of model. And finally, if you are contributing resources to a network, use a competitive request for proposal process to select your final candidate or your final partner. We have an entire session on the RFP process and finding a great candidate and selecting the right partner for your project in order to meet those broadband goals. And that one is on March 23rd. So I would definitely go to that one. Once a partner has been selected, you can move on to formalizing and finalizing that partnership, basically getting everything down on paper. So after the RFP process and any negotiations afterward, it's time to set up a strong contract. The ideal contract will align incentives between you and your partner, provide clear expectations around the roles and timelines for this project, and also outline enforcement and reporting requirements so that you can keep track of what's going on at what stage. Partnerships that you do form in order to close broadband gaps can last for decades, so it's very important to invest time and resources into creating an ideal contract that covers all of your bases. And that finalized partnership should clear the way for fundraising and for execution, all parties knowing exactly what they need to do to contribute and what they need to do. So we just discussed a process that is pretty complicated and has lots of different factors and concerns. But fortunately, we can look to other rural communities to see how they have successfully approached this. So Alex is going to share some examples of problems communities might run into and possible solutions.
Thanks so much, Jane. So as Jane mentioned, that's a pretty long process, complicated process, a lot of steps. What I would say off the bat before we get into some scenarios is that not every community has to take a process that's that in depth and that laborious. That has to do with the diversity of positions that communities are in now, what resources they have to contribute, what they want to contribute, what their actual problems and needs are, and what their actual goals are. So we're going to just talk through some scenarios that we've seen very commonly applied across the country in rural areas, and talk about when you might do something that's more in depth, when you might do something that's lighter touch and in the middle. So just to level set with some kind of scenarios, I'm guessing most of you on the call have unserved areas in your community, right? That's why you're here. Getting those areas served could happen in a number of ways, all with great results for the community, right? You could entice a new ISP that doesn't exist in your county, let's say now, to come into the area and build everywhere so that there's a new interconnected network that connects everyone. You could work with an existing entity that's not a broadband provider to add that to their capabilities, right? An electric provider, Muni Electric co-op, for example. You could work with an existing ISP that offers pretty good speeds, but isn't covered everywhere, to help them extend their infrastructure to actually cover everyone. Or you could work with and entice the phone company to upgrade their old DSL to fiber, which can be a win-win depending on how their business runs. So there's a number of different ways that you can go about kind of achieving the same goals. And the ideal path that you take really may depend on a number of factors unique to your situation. So two very common scenarios that we work with communities whose unserved areas are kind of small, patchy, and disconnected. We also work with rural areas that have large contiguous unserved areas. And I picked these two because this is kind of a very common differentiation between types of communities that have broadband gaps. So starting with the small patchy service gaps, these at the edges of the community. If we are just looking at the cost to fixing the broadband gaps, the answer might be pretty clear, right? The lowest cost solution is usually funding whoever is in the community already with the best infrastructure to extend out a little farther. Often that's an entity like Charter or Comcast, right? They've got cable. The cable generally is fast enough for people. And they're in most of the community, but they're not everywhere. And so working with them to just extend their infrastructure is usually the lowest cost solution. There might be a middle cost solution, which could include helping the electric provider decide to add a fiber product because they own infrastructure already, so it's a little bit cheaper for them to build. The fiber can also help with electric load management and monitoring substations and advanced metering setups. And so it's kind of a win-win. It might not be as cheap as just extending someone's existing infrastructure a little bit, but it's not quite as expensive as bringing a whole new entity into the region that doesn't have any existing infrastructure. And so cost might be the biggest factor. You might kind of take one of these approaches just based on cost. However, one of the reasons why quantifying your gaps and your challenges and your needs right from the beginning is that if you take more of a holistic idea of what you want for your community or what your community wants for itself, there might be a different long-term cost-benefit calculation. And so, for example, the line extension version, the cheapest one we just talked about in a situation where there's kind of patchy coverage, lowest cost, but it does not increase competition in the community because you're having the existing entity extend their infrastructure. Depending on who that existing entity is, it might not address affordability, might not address customer service complaints, right? It might help entrench a monopoly in the community. So, the electric co-op scenario where you help the electric provider add fiber to their offering, not the cheapest, but that can be a way to increase competition. And if that's a goal, over the long term, that might be the best for the community because competition will bring down prices. Studies have shown that it brings down prices an average of 15 to 20% when there's two good viable options. And if that's 15% each month and there's 1,000 customers, that adds up to like hundreds of thousands and millions of dollars, frankly, that stays in the community over the long term. And so that might be a benefit that makes you want to see if there's a way to invest more capital up front and be a little bit more ambitious for a long-term benefit. Same with some of these other ones. There are different kind of cost benefit factors depending on what your goals and needs are. Now, the opposite of the situation where there's a community with little tiny patches would be a community with large contiguous unserved areas. There's in a strange way, the worse your current broadband is and the bigger the gap is, the more flexibility you have at this moment in time. I'm not saying that it's a good thing to have big unserved gaps. However, that typically means that you can be a little bit more flexible with what path you pursue and have a little bit of an easier time doing that. So all the same options as before work here too, right? Finding someone who's already there to help extend their lines, working with the electric provider, working with the ILEC or the phone company, or enticing someone new to the area. But because there are more areas that have bad broadband, you're typically going to be eligible for more grant money. More grant money means more resources available to do more ambitious things. And new ISPs really like large contiguous unserved areas because you get more reliable penetration rates, more people sign up. And it's all about balancing the cost, the increase in cost that comes with building in those unserved areas with balancing the increase in cost with the greater amount of grant money that you likely have available to you. So Does every community need to plan the same way? Absolutely not. Absolutely not. Want to talk about kind of some of the things that when we talk to communities for the first time, we talk about to understand what their right path is. So some questions to consider. First, how ambitious does your community want to be? Do you want to take a more interventionist approach to broadband, or do you want to be relatively hands-off? How much of your own capital are you going to contribute? Are you going to contribute a lot? If so, you kind of need to do the rigorous planning work to back up that contribution and underpin the business plan and make sure that you're being responsible with taxpayer dollars. If you don't have much or any capital contribute and you want to try to facilitate closing the broadband gaps in other ways, you don't have as much leverage, so you probably won't have as many choices. But at the same time, you don't likely need to go through the same rigorous planning process. Other questions, right? Is your likely partner entity an entity that has a good reputation? How much of a profit motive do they have? If it is a municipal electric or electric co-op, obviously their plans need to be sustainable, but they've been in the community. They need to be good community stewards. They need to maintain a good reputation, and so they have more incentives to work really collaboratively with you and transparently. And then I think another question is like, how much do you want to build local capacity in an ongoing way to work on closing the digital divide, right? If this is a passion for you and your community, like it is for us, right? We would say doing more planning, having more community conversations, et cetera, is a great way to build community knowledge and interest in closing the digital divide, because the reality is the needs don't stop after we get the infrastructure built. Then we need to work on adoption and affordability and everything else in order to really allow your community to have the economic and quality of life impact that you can with new infrastructure. Before we get to questions or case studies and questions, I just wanted to go through some. I wouldn't say it's cautionary, but just scenarios where we've seen communities either decide to do some thorough planning or not, and the questions you should be asking and thinking about when you make that decision. So, very common thing over the past couple of years has been ISPs approaching a community to ask for a match for a grant that they're applying for, or a direct contribution in exchange for building in a certain area. This is often a great path for the town, right? It can provide an easy win. It can provide a very visible effort and improvement to connectivity. And to do this casually without planning is totally possible. We've seen it done a lot, but I would just make sure you're thinking about some of these following things here on the right. So the risks of not planning in this situation, right? If you're being asked to make a contribution of funding, but you don't verify what the construction costs are and what they're supporting, right? You risk either overpaying or overpaying as I guess the biggest risk, right? If you're working with someone who you really trust and you verified their numbers, that can give you some assurances. Sometimes it's just, a small $10,000 or $20,000 kind of check on what you're paying for can save you a lot of money in the long run if you find ways to make sure the partner sharpens their pencil, let's say. If you are providing that funding, without doing a whole lot of rigorous planning, you might be missing an opportunity to use that funding for leverage, right? If you understand what the likely cost of your partner are and what you have to provide, you plan around that, you can often ask for a little bit more, whether that's covering more areas or providing free service to municipal buildings or what have you. And then lastly, I think this is the biggest challenge we've seen, if you don't do rigorous planning and you're asked to contribute funding, there's a big risk that your partner's technology that they've chosen or the plan to deployment they've chosen does not work, and does not work as they promised. And a competitive process or a better planning process would have identified a better partner with more optimal technology. So this is the real risk here, because it's reputational risk for the community, and you just want good outcomes for everyone. But it's totally fine too to feel like you've got a handle on these things on the right and take this approach. Another kind of, I wouldn't call it a shortcut, but kind of path that I've seen communities take often is they have some funding that they know they want to put to broadband, and they decide to go right to an RFP process. And the thinking behind that is that the RFP is a competitive process, so the most efficient respondent will win either way, and they don't need to do any planning of their own, because RFP respondents will do that planning as part of their own response, and then it will end in a kind of efficient solution. This can happen. It can happen like that, but the things that I would be careful of if you want to go down this path, one, when you create your RFP with a certain amount of money that you are willing to contribute to the solution, if you don't know how much your funding should cover, that can present risks, right? Either people don't build as much as they should to increase their margins, or you're asking for too much in your RFP and you don't get any responses. And that's something we've seen as well more recently is, town has a couple $1 million. That feels like a lot of money. They put out an RFP asking for someone to serve the entire town. And it turns out that infrastructure is really, really expensive, and they kind of have to start over when they don't get any responses because they're asking for too much relative to the proportion of funding they have. Another thing that we've seen happen, sometimes communities put what we call a poison pill in the RFP, and doing a little bit of a planning process or talking to the potential respondents beforehand would have clued you into some element that would cause an ISP to decline to pursue that opportunity. And then lastly, it's very common that a couple conversations beforehand with RFP respondents will just lead you to a better place. You will have more ideas for better, more collaborative way you approach things. And it's those early conversations where you're getting to know each other, you're understanding the goals, can help really make sure that the respondents are doing something that will benefit the town in the way that you want. Okay, I'm going to keep going into a couple case studies, but if there's any questions, feel free to unmute and just ask away. So I apologize for putting far too much on these slides, but there's a lot here in each one, and we'll be sending out these slides afterwards, and hopefully you all can dig into the case studies that feel most relevant to you. This one I wanted to share because it's a fairly simple partnership, fairly straightforward. Henry County in Tennessee was asked to contribute some of their ARPA funding to match against an ISP that was applying for a state grant program. So town supplied 25% of the CapEx. The West Kentucky Communications presented another 25%, and then the state grant filled in the rest of the 50%. The nice thing about this is that they had done a kind of publicly available feasibility study to see the total cost. So that was shared around and validated by external parties. The division of roles between West Kentucky Communications and the community was well defined. And ultimately, the county got a big win out of it with minimal effort, right? Because of their partner, because of the planning work that their partner had done and that they trusted, and because this entity had a very good reputation in other communities where they've done this work, right? Simple program, took some work, but ended up with a really great outcome. Here is a much more ambitious and complicated type of partnership. This was one between a company called Ting and Westminster, Maryland. There's a lot written about this one online, and I can point you to more resources if this type of thing interests you. But Westminster, Maryland decided to build a network and own it completely themselves and hire Ting, an ISP, on a fee-for-service basis to operate it. This took a lot of planning on the community side. This took a lot of work on their side to, go through the process of planning, owning, and finding an operator with terms that worked. Their hope is that this really helps them reduce costs to their customers or to their residents over the long term because they control the asset. If Ting ends up not being a good provider, they can find another one in its place. This one has some creative lease structures to align incentives. So Ting pays the city of Westminster to be able to use the network on a per passing and a per customer basis. So they pay something like $4 a month for every premise that this network passes, and then $20 a month for everyone who actually signs up as a customer. And that means that both the ISP and the community are incentivized to sign people up, right? So this one is kind of interesting. It's complicated. I'm happy to talk more about this if anyone's curious. But want to go to the last one just to make sure we have plenty of time for questions. This one is kind of a hybrid. And so in Dublin, New Hampshire, as well as other towns in New Hampshire where this has been replicated, the community had a downtown area that was served by cable, and then all the outlying areas were very rural and unserved. What they did here was work with the ILEC to each contribute capital to building a complete fiber network that covered everyone. The ILEC, Consolidated Communications, contributed the money to build downtown where it was already served. The town passed a bond to build in the areas that it was unserved. So it's a 20-year contract, and this gets to the conversation we were having last week, where sometimes you can get around issues with municipal ownership by having a long contract with the private entity to make sure that they're comfortable investing the resources that they need to be an ISP in a region over the long term. And the nice thing about this is that the private entity, Consolidated Communications, they guarantee payments of the bond every month. They put a small infrastructure fee on their fiber service to pay for that. But basically, it is a bond to build part of the network, but it's a very minimal risk situation for the community over the long term. Let me pause there. Any questions or conversations so far? If not, I'm going to call on Cheryl to let us know how their planning has gone and what they've tips and tricks or pitfalls, because she offered.
Oh, Lord Almighty. Yes, this is really good information. I was going back through my notes as I was typing as we were going along. In our case, we have both those big contiguous areas that are not served with very, very few people in them. And then we have a lot of areas that are just little gaps, like side roads that are missed, and even people with just long driveways. I don't know, other places in Appalachia are like this, but people may have a 1/4-mile driveway, and the ISP in their calculation on their return on investment, they'll cover the first 200 feet. So, everything beyond that is supposedly on the back of the customer to get the infrastructure to their house. And the solutions for those situations are not just throw money at it a lot of times. We have done like 3 or 4 different things to try to fix those problems. First of all, is if the guy has a backhoe and he can dig along his own driveway and get a trench opened up, the ISP has allowed that, and then they come in and they put their conduit in the hole, and then the person fills it back in. So that has worked well. In other cases, we have an ARC grant that we are funding Customer Connect subsidies. So, the ISP says, hey, we've got a house that's needs $700 extra that the customer can't afford to get to their house. And we have written them a check for that money, to be allocated for that house. And then we also, got grant money as a public entity. We have a Department of Public Utilities, we have a roads department, and those employees know how to dig trenches and they know how to install conduit. So we have procured some equipment to help us do that. Mostly along county roads where we already have the right of way at the ditch line, but also we've started doing some work. When the customer wants it at their house and they give us permission, we can do a bore across their driveway or wherever we need to do. So there's a lot of things that you have to do beyond just get funding and make somebody else do it.
Yes. 100%. Any other comments or questions at this point? So these are the upcoming sessions wanted to share, because as you know, we're going through things in hopefully logical order, and hoping to end the boot camp sessions with everyone with a kind of fairly comprehensive grounding in what's going on and what broadband deployment requires. Next session is using mapping and data to understand needs and estimate costs. Mapping and data is a huge topic right now because the FCC is currently updating and improving their broadband maps. But we've got a number of other sessions after that. Every week Thursday at 3 p.m. We are skipping the week of March 12th or 13th due to a staff retreat that we have, but we will remind you that we've got a missed week, so that doesn't sneak up on you. Share link. Yes, we will share a link to the upcoming sessions. Absolutely, Sean. That's a good flag. So another just quick point, if you have questions and comments in between sessions, you're obviously welcome to reach out to us. This particular training series has been sponsored by the broadbandhub.org group. This is the National Broadband Resource Hub, and this platform as well is a great place to ask questions and get independent advice. There's 3 pieces to it. There's a resource library with curated in-depth materials, case studies, guides, contracts, and stuff like that. We'd be happy to help you find what you're looking for as well. There's a community conversations page where you can ask questions and find people who have done what you're trying to do before and crowdsource answers and get advice. There's also a help desk where you can sign up to ask questions particular to your situation that you haven't found the answer to anywhere else, and either us or other broadband experts would be happy to help you out. So do write this down, and if you have questions along the way, please reach out to us or reach out through the platform, and we'd be happy to help. You just see if there's anything else in this deck. Oh, so there's a sign up page on the hub just to join the community conversations. Don't be scared by having to create a little profile, but it helps everyone know that they're getting the right information. So thank you all very much. Now I'm happy to hang on for a little bit if folks want to stick around and ask questions, but as always, thank you all. See you next week, and best of luck in the meantime with your broadband planning.